Throughout the history of the United States, one shadow loomed larger than almost any other over the minds of those who held people in bondage: the fear of rebellion. Slaveholders often lived with an unshakable anxiety that those they oppressed might one day rise up and fight back. Most of the challenges they faced were not full-scale uprisings, but rather acts of resistance through escaped men and women risking everything to run away in search of freedom. Yet, in 1831, in the heart of Virginia, that ever-present fear became reality. A man named Nat Turner, deeply religious and convinced he was chosen for a divine mission, led a revolt that shook the South to its core. This was no ordinary escape attempt, no silent act of resistance hidden under the cover of night. It was a direct challenge to the system of slavery itself, striking terror into the hearts of slaveholders and igniting debates across the nation about freedom, justice, and the lengths to which people will go when pushed beyond the limits of human suffering. For enslaved men and women, Nat Turner's rebellion was a symbol that even under unimaginable oppression, the human spirit yearns for liberty. For slaveholders, it was a nightmare come true, a violent reminder that their system was built on a fragile foundation of fear and force. But who was Nat Turner? What shaped his beliefs? And how did he come to lead one of the bloodiest uprisings in American history? What did he hope to achieve? And what was the price paid by both his followers and the innocent? These questions still echo nearly 2 centuries later, forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths about America's past. In this story, we will explore the man behind the rebellion, his childhood, his visions, his unwavering faith, and his decision to take action. We will walk through the events of that fateful summer of 1831, from the first strike against his master's household to the bloody confrontations that followed. And we will examine the devastating aftermath, the brutal reprisals, the tightening of laws against enslaved people, and the way this rebellion both terrified the South and fueled the abolitionist movement in the North. Nat Turner's uprising was more than an episode of violence. It was a turning point in the nation's history. It forced Americans of the time to face a question that could no longer be ignored: can a society built on the dial of freedom truly survive? Before we begin this journey into one of the most controversial and unforgettable chapters of American history, we want to invite you to support this channel. If you find value in exploring stories like this, stories of resilience, tragedy, and the quest for freedom, please take a moment to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more forgotten history to life and ensures that these voices from the past are never silenced. Now, let us step back into the year 1831, into a Virginia simmering with tension, where one man's conviction would change everything. In the early years of the 19th century, in the rolling farmlands of Southampton County, Virginia, a child was born into a world defined by chains. His name was Nat Turner, and though the circumstances of his birth placed him among the enslaved, there was something about him that set him apart even from the beginning. Unlike most children held in bondage, who were deliberately kept from learning the very tools that might empower them, Nat was granted a rare and unusual opportunity by his owner, Benjamin Turner. In a decision that was uncommon for the time, Benjamin allowed Nat, along with a few others, to learn the basics of reading and writing. The Bible was the text placed into his hands, and it would become the foundation of his worldview, shaping the way he interpreted the world and his place within it. For a boy born into captivity, words were not just symbols on a page. They were lifelines, offering glimpses into realms of thought and faith that most enslaved people were forbidden to explore. As Nat absorbed the stories of the Old and New Testaments, he saw himself reflected in their struggles: the Israelites crying out against Pharaoh, prophets rising to speak of justice, Christ carrying the burdens of the oppressed. All of these stories resonated deeply with him. To Nat, the Bible was not simply a book of faith. It was a guide, a mirror of his reality. and a map pointing toward a destiny that seemed to call his name. From an early age, those around him noticed there was something unusual about this young boy. He seemed to possess a memory that defied explanation, recalling events and details from times before his birth, speaking with such precision that many whispered he was touched by something greater. His mother and grandmother reinforced this sense of destiny, telling him that he was chosen for a special purpose. In the isolated cabins and fields where enslaved families whispered their hopes in the dark of night, such words carried immense weight. They were not just comforting phrases. They were sparks that could ignite visions of freedom. Nat grew up deeply devout, fasting, praying, and immersing himself in Scripture with a seriousness that far exceeded his years. For him, faith was not a ritual but a consuming fire. The injustices he witnessed daily, the lashings, the separations of families, the crushing labor were not only human cruelty but, in his, offenses against God. And if God was just, then surely he would not allow such suffering to continue forever. It was only a matter of time. Nat believed, before a divine hand would move. And perhaps, he thought, he was meant to be that instrument. Life was never stable for him. Like so many others enslaved in Virginia, he was passed from one plantation to another. At 21, he briefly attempted to run away, a desperate act of resistance that many before him had tried. But after a month in hiding, he returned. He claimed later that God had given him a sign, instructing him that his purpose was not to flee but to remain, to wait, and to prepare for something far greater. This sense of divine mission only deepened his resolve. He became more than just a worker in the fields. He became a preacher, a man whose words carried weight among his fellow enslaved people. When Nat spoke, others listened. His sermons were filled with Scripture, but also with a fire that hinted at something beyond the everyday struggle, a promise of deliverance. It was in these moments, speaking before small gatherings of the oppressed, that his ideas began to take form. The Bible told of battles between good and evil, of serpents crushed, of yokes broken. Nat Turner saw his world through that lens, and he came to believe that just as God had acted in the past, he would act again in Virginia. Signs seemed to surround him. A solar eclipse in 1831 was, to him, not simply a natural event but a divine message the sun obscured, the heavens declaring that the time had come. In his, the hand of God had reached down and written his orders across the sky. The story of Nat Turner cannot be separated from the faith that guided him, nor from the extraordinary chance he had to read and write when so many others could not. Literacy gave him the power to interpret his world through the lens of Scripture, and Scripture gave him the conviction that he was chosen for a higher calling. Each passage he read, each vision he claimed to receive, each word of encouragement from his family built upon the foundation laid in his earliest years on Benjamin Turner's plantation. By the time he reached adulthood, he was no longer merely a man enduring oppression. He saw himself as a prophet, destined to rise against the injustice that bound his people. This sense of purpose would set him on a path that would alter the course of American history. A path marked by blood and tragedy, but also by a relentless pursuit of freedom. In Nat Turner's story, the decision of one owner to place a Bible in a boy's hands became the seed of an uprising that would terrify a nation and echo for generations to come. To understand why he acted as he did, and why others followed him, one must return to these beginnings. A boy born into captivity, who learned to read words that promised liberation, who grew up hearing that he was chosen for something greater. It was here, in the quiet fields of Southampton, that the first chapter of rebellion was written, not with weapons or bloodshed, but with Scripture, visions, and the unwavering belief that God had set aside one man to shake the foundations of slavery itself. From an early age, Turner stood apart from the world around him, not merely because of his unusual access to reading and writing, but because of the way he carried himself with a quiet conviction that seemed beyond his years. As he grew older, those who lived near him began to notice that he's not only well versed in the scriptures, but that he could interpret them in ways that left others shaken, as though he spoke with an authority that came from somewhere far beyond his own life experience. In a time and place where most men in his condition had little hope of education or spiritual leadership, Turner emerged as something different, someone who believed he had been given not just knowledge, but a sacred mission. He immersed himself in the Bible, not as a collection of stories or moral lessons, but as a living text that spoke directly to him. Each passage became a revelation, and every vision or dream seemed to carry with it a message that confirmed what he already suspected, that he had been chosen by God for something far greater than ordinary existence. Those around him saw the way he spoke, the fire in his eyes, and the steady certainty in his voice, and they began to call him a prophet. It was not a title he sought, yet it followed him, whispered in conversations, spoken aloud in gatherings, and carried forward by those who were hungry for meaning in lives marked by hardship and oppression. Turner himself did not dismiss these whispers. Rather, he embraced them with the gravity of a man who felt the weight of divine responsibility. He believed that God communicated with him in ways that went beyond words on a page. At night, visions came to him, symbols of light and darkness, scenes of struggle and liberation that he interpreted as signs pointing toward his destiny. The natural world seemed to echo this calling. Eclipses, storms, and other celestial events were read not as mere phenomena, but as messages confirming that the time for change was approaching. To Turner, nothing was random, and every sign held meaning that tied back to the mission he believed he had been entrusted with. This deep religious conviction did not isolate him. Instead, it gave him influence among those who felt that their voices were unheard in the wider world. He preached with intensity, weaving biblical passages into narratives that touched on freedom, justice, and divine will. People listened, not only because of his eloquence, but because his words gave shape to the feelings many carried silently in their hearts. His ability to connect spiritual truth with lived experience made him more than a preacher. It made him a leader in thought and spirit, even before he acted in any outward way. The strength of his belief was matched by the discipline with which he carried himself. Turner was not reckless, nor was he consumed by anger without direction. Rather, he was deliberate, patient, and contemplative, which made his sense of divine purpose all the more powerful. To those who knew him, he was a man apart, someone marked by destiny. His faith did not waver even in the face of hardship, and that unshakable conviction inspired others to see in him the possibility of something extraordinary. For Turner, the line between vision and reality blurred. He was convinced that he had been chosen, not simply to interpret Scripture, but to embody its message through action. He spoke often of the deliverance of Israel, of prophets who had risen in dark times to lead their people, and of the unwavering justice of God who promised that no suffering was without end. These themes resonated deeply with his listeners, who saw in their own condition the mirror of ancient stories, and in Turner the possibility of a modern Moses. This belief in divine selection was not an abstract idea for Turner. It was the foundation of his life. Every step he took was measured against the question of whether it brought him closer to fulfilling God's will. Every vision was weighed for its meaning, every scripture studied for guidance. His days became a pattern of prayer, reflection, and teaching, always oriented toward the larger destiny he believed awaited him. He was convinced that when the time was right, a clear sign would be given, and he would know that the moment had come to act. Yet this sense of being chosen was both a gift and a burden. It gave him strength, but it also set him apart from others, for few could fully understand the intensity of his conviction. Turner often wrestled alone with the enormity of what he believed was expected of him. To carry the role of prophet meant not only inspiring hope, but also bearing the weight of expectation. His visions were not always comforting. Some revealed struggle and sacrifice. And he understood that fulfilling God's purpose might demand everything from him. Still, he did not turn away. Turner leaned into the role that faith had carved for him, allowing it to shape his thoughts and actions. As he moved through his daily life, whether working under the watchful eye of those who claimed ownership over him, or speaking quietly with those who sought his counsel, the sense of divine mission never left him. It was a constant presence, guiding him, steadying him, reminding him that his life had meaning beyond its immediate circumstances. By the time he reached adulthood, Turner was no longer just another man laboring in Southampton County. He had become a figure who stirred both curiosity and reverence. Someone who seemed to walk with a certainty that defied the oppressive structures of his time. To those who listened, his words were not merely interpretations of Scripture, but glimpses into a larger plan that promised transformation. To Turner himself, the certainty was absolute. God had chosen him, and no earthly power could silence the call that burned within his soul. In this way, Turner's faith and the reputation it created became inseparable from his identity. He was more than a preacher, more than a visionary. He was a man convinced that he stood at the intersection of heaven's will and earth's suffering. And as the signs grew clearer in his mind, as visions and Scripture intertwined to form a narrative of divine justice, he prepared himself for the day when belief would give way to action, and when the role of prophet would demand not just words but deeds. From a young age, Turner was marked as different, not only because of his intelligence and ability to read the Scriptures, but also because of the profound way he spoke about the world around him. He had been taught that every event in life carried meaning, that no moment passed without significance, and that signs could be found in the rhythm of nature itself if one only had the patience to look closely. For Turner, this was not mere poetry, it was conviction. He believed the heavens themselves spoke to him, that the quiet sway of the trees, the sudden crack of thunder, and the eerie darkness of an eclipse were all part of a grand design unfolding before his eyes. This belief set him apart, for while others might dismiss such occurrences as coincidence, Turner saw in them a message that demanded action. The conviction grew slowly, like a fire kindled from a spark, until it burned too brightly to ignore. He spoke of visions that came to him in the stillness of night or in the solitude of prayer. Visions that carried images both frightening and inspiring. In these visions, he saw a world overturned, a place where those who suffered were lifted up, and those who had caused suffering were brought low. He did not see himself as a man imagining fantasies, but as someone entrusted with a sacred mission, a messenger called to act when the time was right. Every unusual event in the skies, every moment that broke the rhythm of ordinary life, only confirmed what he already felt in his bones, that he had been chosen for something that went beyond his own existence. One of the most powerful experiences for Turner was his interpretation of eclipses. Where many saw only the unsettling dimming of daylight, he perceived divine intervention. The sun, veiled in shadow, was no accident, it was a signal. For Turner, these eclipses were messages written across the sky, declarations from a power far greater than any earthly authority. They were not meant to terrify but to prepare, to awaken those who could see with spiritual eyes. Each time the world darkened unexpectedly, it was as if the heavens themselves confirmed his role in the story that was about to unfold. He believed the earth and sky were aligned with him, whispering that the moment of reckoning was approaching. This growing certainty shaped not only his thoughts, but also the way others viewed him. Those around him began to see Turner as a man apart, someone whose words carried a strange and unsettling authority. He spoke with calm conviction, never with boastfulness, but with the quiet strength of someone who believed he was guided by forces beyond mortal understanding. His reputation spread as one who could interpret mysteries and uncover meaning in the world's most perplexing events. People whispered that he had been given the gift of prophecy, and whether out of faith or fear, many listened when he spoke. In a world where hope was fragile and often crushed, the presence of a man who claimed to see a higher purpose was both dangerous and magnetic. Turner himself did not view his role as one of personal glory. He did not claim greatness for himself, but instead described his visions as burdens he could not escape. He saw himself as an instrument, compelled to act because ignoring the call would be an act of disobedience to the divine will. It weighed on him, filling his days with restless energy and his nights with dreams that refused to let him sleep in peace. He began to feel that the longer he waited, the heavier the responsibility became, until silence itself seemed like betrayal. His life was not his own. It was a path carved out for him by hands unseen, and he was walking it with a mixture of dread and determination. As his sense of destiny deepened, so too did his interpretation of the world around him. A sudden storm might be, to others, a passing inconvenience. But to Turner it was a declaration that change was coming. A harvest moon glowed not merely with beauty but with warning, a reminder that time was running short. The world itself became a book of signs, every page written with symbols that only he seemed able to read, and in his telling of these visions, those who listened could not help but feel drawn into his conviction. Whether they believed in the literal truth of his claims or simply sensed the unshakable force of his faith, they could not deny that his words carried the power to stir hearts and ignite restless minds. This belief in signs and visions did not isolate Turner. It bound him more tightly to his people. For many, his words gave shape to emotions they had long felt but could not articulate. The hunger for justice, the longing for freedom, the desire for dignity in a world that stripped it away, all these found expression in the way Turner spoke of divine guidance. He did not simply tell them that their suffering mattered. He told them that the heavens themselves had noticed, that the natural world had declared it was time for change. In his visions, their pain was not forgotten but transformed into a catalyst for action. In this way, Turner became more than a man of visions. He became a living symbol of hope. Each eclipse he interpreted, each dream he recounted, and each sign he revealed added to the sense that history itself was waiting for them to rise. The burden of his visions pressed heavily on him, but it also created a bridge between his private faith and the collective yearning of those who heard him. To Turner, the divine signals were clear. The moment to act would come, and when it did, it would not be a matter of choice but of destiny fulfilled. Thus, the figure of Nat Turner emerged, not only as a man of profound spiritual conviction, but as someone who gave voice to a vision larger than himself. The heavens, the earth, and the very flow of time seemed to point him toward a future that demanded courage and sacrifice. In his heart, he believed he was answering a call written long before he was born. A call that found its expression in the darkness of eclipses, the fire of his visions, and the unshakable faith that he was chosen for a purpose that could not be denied. For years, Nat Turner moved quietly among the plantations of Southampton County, carrying with him not only the burdens of bondage, but also the conviction that he had been chosen for something far greater than a life of submission. He was not reckless in his purpose, nor did he allow his emotions to dictate his every step. Instead, he cultivated patience, recognizing that timing would be everything if his vision was ever to become reality. Those who worked alongside him often sensed a gravity in his presence, a quiet intensity that separated him from others, though few could imagine the fire that smoldered beneath his calm demeanor. Turner believed his destiny was written in the natural signs he had witnessed: solar eclipses, blood-red moons, and other phenomena he interpreted as messages from a higher power, and he became convinced that these signs demanded action. But he also knew that the scale of what he contemplated required careful preparation. For one man alone could not rise without being swiftly crushed. In secret conversations held under the cover of night, Away from the ears of overseers and masters, Turner began to share fragments of his vision with men he trusted most. He chose not those who spoke loudly of discontent, but rather those who carried themselves with restraint. Men who could be relied upon to guard a dangerous secret. In them he planted seeds of purpose, carefully measuring their loyalty and their resolve. Slowly, a circle of confidence formed around him, bound not just by friendship, but by a shared belief that their suffering did not have to stretch endlessly into the future. Turner never revealed everything at once, instead allowing the plan to unfold piece by piece, so that each man could internalize the weight of what they were being asked to join. Years passed in this manner, with Turner appearing outwardly as any other enslaved man working the fields or tending to his duties, while beneath that facade he constructed a vision of freedom in which the chains of bondage would be cast aside. Every small act of kindness, every word of encouragement whispered in private, became a thread in a tapestry of loyalty that bound his recruits together. Turner himself was not immune to fear, for he knew the consequences of discovery. Yet he believed so firmly in his divine calling that hesitation could not deter him. To falter would mean betraying not only his own convictions, but also the generations who had suffered before him, and those yet to be born who deserved a life unshackled from oppression. The date he originally set for this uprising was July 4th, 1831, a day rich with irony and symbolism. On that day, America would be celebrating its own independence, commemorating the declaration that boldly proclaimed all men were created equal, even as men like Turner toiled in fields, denied every right and dignity such words promised. For Turner and his followers, striking on that date would have sent a message far beyond Southampton County. It would have exposed the hypocrisy at the heart of a nation that celebrated liberty while perpetuating bondage. The alignment of their struggle with the nation's most cherished holiday seemed almost providential, as though the very calendar had conspired to support their cause. In hushed tones, the plan was whispered from one man to another. Weapons would be seized where they could be found. Numbers would grow as others joined once the rising began, and Turner's visions would serve as both inspiration and justification. Though few written records exist of these clandestine conversations, one can imagine the mixture of hope and dread that filled the air as they plotted. For the men involved, the stakes were absolute failure meant death or worse, while success offered a fleeting chance at freedom and perhaps the beginning of a broader transformation. Yet as July approached, Turner was unsettled. He continued to observe the world around him with the same intensity that had always guided him. And when the signs did not align as he expected, he grew cautious. He had long believed that the heavens themselves marked the moments when action was to be taken. And without their confirmation, he hesitated to press forward. He could not afford to mistake his own eagerness for divine instruction. To act prematurely might doom them all. And so, with reluctance but with conviction, he postponed the plan, convinced that another signal would reveal the proper time. In delaying, Turner only deepened the faith of those around him. They saw in his patience not weakness but discipline, the careful resolve of a leader unwilling to gamble with their lives on a whim. This choice reinforced the sense that they were participating not in an impulsive outbreak of anger, but in a purposeful, divinely guided mission. It was this fusion of spiritual conviction and strategic calculation that made Turner such a compelling figure. He was not simply urging men to rise because of their suffering. Suffering was an old, familiar companion. Instead, he was calling them to action because he believed history itself had opened a door, and they were meant to walk through it together. The waiting did not diminish his determination. It only sharpened it. In the months after July 4th passed without incident, Turner continued to gather strength, to prepare, and to watch for the sign he knew would come. Each day, beneath the surface of routine labor, the men who shared his vision carried within them the knowledge of what was to come, moving silently among those who had no idea that history was being written in their midst. This balance between ordinary appearance and extraordinary intent gave their plot a kind of invisible power, one that would remain hidden until the moment arrived when silence would be broken and the long-suppressed storm would finally erupt. Turner's decision to align his uprising with a date of such national significance underscores not only his awareness of symbolism, but also his keen understanding of history. He was not simply fighting for himself, or even for those directly around him. He was, stepping into the current of a larger narrative, challenging the very meaning of freedom in a land that celebrated it with parades and fireworks, while denying it in practice. That contradiction could not last forever, and Turner was determined to play his part in exposing it. His choice of July 4th spoke to a profound recognition. The ideals proclaimed in 1776 had not yet been fulfilled, and perhaps it would take voices like his, raised in defiance, to remind the nation of its unfinished promises. Thus, beneath the summer skies of 1831, as fields ripened and celebrations echoed across the land, Turner's followers waited in tense anticipation, bound together by a shared secret that pulsed like a heartbeat beneath the quiet rhythms of plantation life. Though the moment would be delayed, their resolve had been forged, and with each passing day, the idea of freedom grew not weaker but stronger, gathering weight until it could no longer be contained. In the summer of 1831, as the fields of Virginia swayed in the heat and the days grew heavy with anticipation, Nat Turner's long-formed plans began to take on a new urgency. For years, he had prepared in silence, carefully weaving together the threads of trust, secrecy, and resolve among those who believed in his vision. His original intention had been to act on July 4th, a date steeped in irony, when the nation that celebrated its independence could be reminded of the countless people still bound in chains. Yet circumstances had forced a delay, and as the days stretched into weeks, Turner searched for meaning, wondering when the moment would present itself again. He had always been a man who saw signs in the world around him, believing that nature, the sky, and even sudden shifts in the weather carried divine messages. That August, the heavens gave him one. On the day of the solar eclipse, an eerie darkness fell over the land. Birds quieted, crops stood still under the strange dimming of the sun, and whispers spread quickly through the community. To Turner, this was no ordinary occurrence. He saw in it a direct signal, a sign that the time had come to act, that waiting any longer might weaken the resolve he had built so carefully. Along with the eclipse came other atmospheric disturbances, unusual patterns in the skies that unsettled the people and seemed to bend the natural order. For Turner, steeped in both spiritual visions and the harsh realities of bondage, these events were not accidents of nature but confirmations that his mission was righteous and that destiny itself was urging him forward. The eclipse lingered in his thoughts, fusing with years of prophetic dreams and visions he had carried since youth. He interpreted the darkened sun as a divine hand sweeping across the sky, a warning to the oppressors and a call to action for the oppressed. Those who gathered with him felt its weight as well, though they did not see with the same intensity. Turner's voice carried conviction when he spoke of what he believed had been revealed to him, and in that conviction, others found courage. Fear was ever present, but it was balanced by the belief that they were part of something greater, something that might alter the future, not only for themselves but for generations yet unborn. As the days after the eclipse unfolded, Turner moved with a renewed sense of clarity. He no longer questioned the timing, no longer hesitated with the endless calculations of risk. He began gathering the final commitments, speaking in hushed tones to those who had long been part of the plan, reminding them of their shared oath and the faith that bound them together. Some had doubts, but Turner's certainty had a way of stilling those voices. He invoked the image of the darkened sun and the trembling earth as proof that their cause was not only just but divinely sanctioned. It was as if the universe itself had set the stage, and all that remained was for them to play their part. The atmosphere among his closest companions shifted. There was an edge in every conversation, an unspoken understanding that their lives were about to be transformed forever. Nights were restless, filled with whispers and quiet preparations, as they sharpened tools and whispered prayers, waiting for the signal to move. Turner's leadership was not loud or forceful but calm, steady, and rooted in an unshakable belief that what they were about to do was not rebellion for its own sake but an act of destiny. For those who followed him, this distinction mattered. It gave meaning to their risks, turning fear into purpose. When the moment finally arrived, it did not come with fanfare or dramatic announcement. It was marked by a quiet resolve, born of the eclipse and the strange disturbances that had unsettled the land. Turner gathered his trusted circle, and together they prepared to step into history. The air was thick with tension, yet also with the weight of inevitability. They knew that what they were about to unleash would change everything, that there would be no turning back once the first step was taken. In the silence before action, the memory of the darkened sun seemed to hover over them, a reminder of the moment the heavens themselves had given their blessing. And so, with hearts heavy and determined, they set out, driven by the belief that the signs had aligned and that their time had truly come. The eclipse was more than a celestial event. It had become a symbol, a spark that turned years of secret planning into decisive movement. For Turner, it was proof that his visions had not been illusions but glimpses of a future he was meant to bring forth. For those who followed, it was the bridge between doubt and courage, a reminder that even in the darkest shadow, there could be light waiting on the other side. The world beyond them would soon come to know the consequences of that choice. But in that moment, standing at the edge of action, it was the eclipse, its strangeness, its mystery, its sense of destiny that gave them the final push. In the pre-dawn hours of August 21st, 1831, the rebellion that had been whispered about in secret meetings and dreamed about in restless sleep finally erupted into action. For Turner and his companions, the moment had come when visions, omens, and years of unbearable suffering converged into a single path. Their first target was the home of Joseph Travis, where Turner had once labored and endured the weight of his bondage. Moving through the stillness of the early morning, Turner and his men entered the Travis household, and with grim determination they struck the first blow of their uprising. What began in that house did not end there. It was the ignition of a movement that swept like fire across the countryside. As dawn broke, the group expanded their mission. They moved from one house to another, striking with an intensity born of generations of pain and hope for freedom. Roughly 60 white inhabitants of Southampton County were killed during the uprising, while enslaved men and women, seeing a chance to escape the chains of servitude, joined the rebellion as it surged forward. For Turner, this was not simply about vengeance. It was, in his, the fulfillment of a divine purpose, a reckoning that had been revealed to him through dreams and visions. He believed he was chosen to bring about a new chapter, and his followers, carried by both fear and hope, saw in his leadership the possibility of a life beyond bondage. The news of their actions spread rapidly, carried by terrified survivors and the distant echo of chaos. The countryside, which had so often lain in quiet monotony under the heat of the Virginia sun, now trembled with uncertainty. Plantation homes that once stood as symbols of wealth and control became sites of fear, their doors barred against the possibility that Turner's band might arrive at any moment. Yet, for the enslaved people across the county, the story unfolding before their eyes was something different, a flicker of possibility that the system which held them captive could, however briefly, be challenged. Some joined eagerly. Others hesitated, torn between the dream of liberty and the fear of violent reprisal. As the rebellion grew in strength, so too did its symbolic power. It was not only an attack on individuals, but also on the very structure of slavery itself. Each freed companion represented another soul awakened to the idea that they were not born merely to serve, but to live as free men and women. The rebellion became a living message, carried from plantation to plantation. That resistance was possible, even in the face of overwhelming odds. In every step they took, in every door they forced open, Turner's band was rewriting the boundaries of fear and hope in Southampton County. But even in these hours of intensity, the reality of what they faced was clear. They were vastly outnumbered and outgunned, and the militia would soon rise against them with force. Still, they pressed on, because to stop was to surrender, and to surrender was to return to chains. For those few days, the rebellion was a storm sweeping across the land, and it was impossible to ignore. The world that had always seemed fixed and immovable suddenly appeared fragile, vulnerable to collapse under the weight of the determination of a handful of men willing to risk everything for freedom. The path of destruction they carved was not random, it was the expression of long-suppressed voices, of lives denied autonomy and dignity. In the homes they entered, Turner and his followers were not only breaking physical barriers, but also confronting the system that had dictated who could be free and who must remain enslaved. To the enslavers, their homes had been sanctuaries of power. To Turner and his rebels, they were reminders of oppression, and tearing them open was an act of both rebellion and justice as they understood it. The fear among the white population of Virginia spread faster than the rebellion itself. Rumors magnified the numbers of Turner's force, transforming dozens into hundreds in the minds of those who heard the stories. Panic swept through towns, with families fleeing and militias scrambling to mobilize. In those hours, Turner's small band held an influence far greater than their actual numbers, their actions unsettling the very foundation of society. The uprising's scale may have been limited, but its psychological impact was enormous, a sudden reminder that the enslaved, though controlled in daily life, were never truly broken in spirit. As Turner and his men pressed onward, there was a grim inevitability to their journey. They could not turn back. The blood spilled had already set their course, and the world as they knew it could never return to what it had been. Every step forward was another step into history, another mark on the long and painful struggle against slavery. Even though many enslaved people chose not to join, whether out of fear, loyalty, or uncertainty, those who did became part of a story that would echo far beyond Virginia, inspiring both terror and reflection across the United States. For Turner himself, this was the moment when his visions became flesh, when prophecy walked hand in hand with reality. He had spoken of signs in the heavens, of celestial warnings and divine command, and now those words had been transformed into action. The rebellion was not only a political act, but also, in Turner's mind, a spiritual fulfillment. To his followers, this belief infused their struggle with meaning, giving them the courage to continue even when the odds seemed hopeless. By the time the rebellion began to falter, its message had already taken root. The uprising demonstrated that resistance was possible, that the enslaved were not passive subjects but human beings with will, agency, and the ability to fight back. It shattered the illusion of total control and forced even those who opposed slavery to confront its brutal realities. Although many lives were lost and the rebellion would soon be suppressed, what Turner and his band had unleashed could not be erased. The echo of those days in August 1831 would reverberate for generations, fueling debates, fears, and movements that would continue to shape the nation. The events of that day, beginning with the Travis household and spreading outward, were more than just a violent episode. They were a turning point, a moment when the system of slavery trembled under the weight of its own injustices. In their defiance, Turner and his followers carved a place in history, not merely as rebels, but as symbols of the unyielding desire for freedom. And though their rebellion was short-lived, its memory endured, haunting the conscience of a nation and reminding all who would listen that even the most oppressed could rise, and that no chain could silence forever the human yearning for liberty. armed mostly with farm tools and whatever simple weapons they could find. Turner's rebels pressed forward under the cover of night and early morning, driven by a mix of desperation, conviction, and the haunting weight of centuries of oppression. Their weapons were not those of trained soldiers, but rather the everyday tools of survival: axes, hatchets, clubs, and a few guns taken along the way. These implements of toil, once used to cultivate the land for others' profit, became symbols of defiance, wielded by men who no longer saw themselves as mere laborers, but as fighters in a struggle for dignity and freedom. Each step they took was filled with both courage and dread, for they knew the consequences of failure would be merciless. Yet what drove them onward was stronger than fear: the dream of a different world where their children could live without chains, and where their voices would no longer be silenced. As they moved from house to house, the rebellion took on a rhythm both grim and purposeful. They specifically targeted the households of slave-owning families, believing that by striking at the very heart of the system, they could dismantle the structures that kept them subjugated. It was not blind rage, but a deliberate act of resistance, one rooted in the knowledge that their condition could not be changed through appeals or patience. At the same time, accounts note that they chose to spare some poor white families, viewing them as people who shared little in the privileges of the wealthy planters. This distinction reveals a calculated strategy, an attempt to frame the rebellion not as a war against every white person, but against the specific power structures that perpetuated slavery. Turner and his companions understood that the wealthy elite were the true pillars of the institution, and in their minds, it was against them that justice had to be delivered. The countryside of Southampton County became the backdrop of this unfolding drama. Quiet farms and small houses that had long been symbols of plantation dominance now witnessed the chaos of uprising. The rebels freed those who were enslaved as they advanced, urging them to join the march. Though not all chose to take part, some, gripped by fear of what might follow, remained behind, while others, inspired by Turner's determination, added their strength to the movement. The numbers of the rebellion swelled and then contracted, fluctuating with each encounter, yet the message was unmistakable. A people long dismissed as voiceless had risen to declare their refusal to endure bondage any longer. The news of the insurrection spread faster than the rebels could travel. Each act of defiance reverberated through the region, unsettling not only the planters but also the wider community, who realized that the security of the old order was far more fragile than they had imagined. For generations, the enslaved had been seen as powerless. But now, armed with tools from the fields, they were overturning that assumption. Fear rippled through the countryside, and what had once seemed unshakable suddenly appeared vulnerable. Turner himself, though not commanding a vast army, embodied a spirit that magnified the rebellion's impact. His leadership was not just in directing where to go, but in articulating, through action, the deep grievances and unfulfilled hopes of his people. This uprising was not simply about immediate revenge. It was a declaration that the institution of slavery was intolerable. The choice of weapons, the very implements used to build and sustain the system, added a layer of symbolic weight. To strike with an axe or a hoe was to turn the instruments of forced labor into instruments of liberation. The rebellion challenged the assumptions of those who had believed that the enslaved were too dependent, too beaten down, or too divided to rise against their condition. Each confrontation, each step taken by Turner's group, was a living testament to the resilience and willpower that slavery had sought, but failed to extinguish. As daylight broke and hours stretched into the day, the rebels continued their march. Yet with each move forward, they also knew the dangers were closing in. Militias and armed civilians were beginning to organize in response. The rebellion had struck fear into the hearts of slaveholders across Virginia, and swift retaliation was inevitable. Still, in those crucial hours, Turner's band achieved something extraordinary. They shattered the illusion of complete control. They revealed, in the most dramatic way possible, that the enslaved were not passive subjects, but human beings capable of resistance, planning, and sacrifice. In retelling this moment, one cannot ignore the moral complexity it raises. The violence, though unsettling, was born from a society that had itself been built on violence and coercion. The actions of Turner's rebels cannot be separated from the brutal realities of bondage they endured. Their uprising, carried out with farm tools instead of rifles and cannons, was the cry of people who had no other path to assert their humanity. To understand this chapter is not to glorify the bloodshed, but to recognize the desperation and determination that fueled it. It stands as a reminder of the cost of a system that dehumanized millions and left them with choices that were few, harsh, and born of necessity. In the end, Turner's rebellion became one of the most significant uprisings in American history, not for its scale of military success, but for the questions it forced upon the nation. Could a society built on oppression truly endure when those it sought to silence found ways to speak with such force? Could the vision of freedom, even when expressed through rebellion, be ignored forever? These questions linger long after the clash of that August morning, echoing through history as a testament to the unbreakable spirit of those who refused to accept life in chains. When the uprising reached its most daring stage, Turner and his followers fixed their eyes on a bold objective that had the potential to transform their desperate struggle into a sustained campaign. They intended to seize an armory, believing that the muskets and ammunition stored there would give them the means to stand against organized resistance and extend their reach beyond isolated attacks on farms and homesteads. The vision was not only to arm themselves more effectively, but also to inspire others across the region who lived under the same oppressive system. Word of a group armed not with farm tools but with real weapons of war could have sent tremors through the countryside, rallying many more to their cause. It was an audacious gamble, born of desperation but also of a calculated understanding that no rebellion could endure long without access to proper weapons. As Turner led his followers toward this critical target, the atmosphere was charged with both hope and fear. They had tasted success in the early stages of the revolt, catching slave-owning families unprepared and instilling a sudden, raw terror in the hearts of those who had long felt untouchable. Yet this success also had consequences. Word of their actions traveled quickly, and the alarm spread faster than the rebels themselves could move. Militia forces, hastily assembled from local men who knew the terrain well, began to mobilize and track their movements. What had begun as a series of swift strikes soon became a dangerous race against time, with Turner's small force pressing forward while the militia closed in. The encounter at the armory marked the turning point of the rebellion. Instead of finding the supplies and weapons they so desperately needed, the rebels were met with organized resistance. The militia, armed and disciplined, stood ready, their presence a grim reminder that the system Turner sought to overthrow had deep roots and formidable defenders. The clash was brutal and swift. Many of Turner's followers, who had wielded only makeshift weapons until this moment, fell before they could mount a meaningful resistance. The vision of turning scattered attacks into a sustained war dissolved in the smoke and chaos of that failed attempt. Turner, however, did not fall alongside his companions. With remarkable resilience and instinct for survival, he managed to slip away from the battlefield and disappear into the surrounding woods. For weeks he lived as a fugitive, evading capture while hidden in the tangled undergrowth of Virginia's forests. His escape was not the triumphant continuation of a larger campaign, but rather the lonely struggle of a man who had seen both the brief possibility of liberation and the crushing weight of defeat. In those silent nights beneath the canopy of trees, Turner must have reflected on the cost of his rebellion, the followers who had given their lives, and the harsh reality that the system remained intact despite their daring stand. The failed seizure of the armory is a moment heavy with symbolism. It illustrates both the extraordinary courage of those who dared to rise and the overwhelming power of the forces arrayed against them. The very idea that men armed with farm tools and driven by desperation would attempt to storm a fortified position reveals a profound determination that went beyond individual survival. They sought to carve a path toward freedom in the face of impossible odds, knowing full well that failure likely meant death. Yet in Turner's survival after the clash, there is also a lingering echo of resistance. Though his immediate goals had collapsed, his escape kept alive the story of defiance. For those who would later hear of his actions, he was not simply a defeated rebel, but a figure who had dared to strike at the very heart of an oppressive order. His ability to evade capture for so long only added to the sense of legend surrounding his name. Even as authorities hunted him, his story spread, whispered among the enslaved and discussed with dread by those in power. The days following the failed attempt were marked by relentless crackdowns. Communities were swept into turmoil, suspicion and fear dictating harsh reprisals that would claim the lives of many who had no part in the rebellion at all. The brutality of the response only underscored how deeply shaken the ruling order had been by Turner's actions, and how close they feared the system had come to unraveling. In this sense, even in failure, Turner had forced the society around him to confront the fragility of its foundations. The attempt to seize the armory remains one of the most dramatic episodes of Turner's uprising because it embodies the dual nature of the rebellion: extraordinary bravery and devastating loss. It was the moment when the hope of turning a localized revolt into a movement of liberation flickered brightest, only to be extinguished in the clash with a better armed enemy. Yet its memory continued to burn, a testament to the courage of those who risked everything in pursuit of a dream they knew might not be realized in their lifetimes. Though Turner wandered the forests after the defeat, his presence lingered like a shadow over the region. The failed plan and his survival became intertwined in the narrative of resistance. It was a reminder that while the rebellion had been crushed, the longing for freedom could not be so easily extinguished. The armory may have remained closed to Turner and his followers, but the story of their attempt opened a door in the imagination of many, showing that even the most entrenched systems could be challenged by those who dared to dream of something different. When news of the uprising spread beyond the immediate region, the fear it provoked was like a spark falling into dry grass, igniting panic across the countryside. White militias and hastily gathered mobs poured into the fields, towns, and woods, determined not only to crush any remaining traces of rebellion, but also to restore a sense of control that had been shaken by the very idea that enslaved people could rise in organized resistance. Yet in their fury, the distinction between those who had joined Turner's revolt and those who were simply living their lives was quickly lost, as violence consumed anyone who looked like they might have supported the cause. Entire communities trembled as the search for rebels widened, and the grim toll that followed fell not only on those involved in the uprising but on countless men, women, and children who had never lifted a weapon. The numbers tell a chilling story. Historical accounts estimate that between 100 and 200 black people were killed during these reprisal raids, far more than the number of lives lost in the rebellion itself. Many of the victims were innocent, uninvolved, caught in the sweep of rage and fear that blinded those seeking revenge. Some were dragged from their homes without question. Others were shot or beaten in fields where they had worked only hours before. It became a collective punishment, a reminder of how little value was placed on black life in a society that was willing to sacrifice the innocent to maintain its order. The retaliations blurred the line between justice and vengeance, creating a wave of terror that would echo for generations. What made this chapter even more haunting was not only the scale of the violence, but the gruesome displays meant to reinforce submission. Heads of the slain were placed on poles at crossroads and along public roads, stark warnings meant to send a message to every enslaved person who might dare to dream of freedom. These horrific images became instruments of fear, teaching through brutality that resistance would be met not with trials or reason, but with overwhelming cruelty. Travelers who passed through the countryside would have seen them, stark and undeniable symbols of the social order that white authorities were desperate to maintain. In the minds of those who placed them there, it was not only about punishing individuals, but about reasserting dominance over an entire population. This retaliatory violence shows us how revolts did not simply end when the fighting stopped but rippled outward, reshaping the lives of countless people who had no role in the initial conflict. Families lost fathers, brothers, and sons in the reprisals, not because they had joined Turner, but because their skin marked them as suspect. Mothers and children lived in fear of the knock at the door, or the approach of armed men in the night. The aftermath became its own chapter of suffering, one that underscored the extreme measures a slave-holding society was willing to take to preserve itself. It is difficult not to see in these reprisals the cruelty of a system so deeply afraid of change that it answered hope with horror. Yet in this terror, we also find a bitter irony. The violent reprisals, meant to erase the memory of resistance, instead ensured that the story of the revolt would never be forgotten. The scale of the response revealed the depth of the fear that Nat Turner's rebellion had instilled, and in trying to extinguish it, white authorities unintentionally confirmed how powerful the act of resistance had been. The very brutality of the response showed just how fragile the slave system was, how much force it required to keep millions in chains, and how desperate its defenders were to silence even a whisper of rebellion. The poles lined with warnings became symbols not only of oppression, but also of the deep cracks in the system itself. Cracks that could be seen even by those who tried to deny them. For those who lived through it, the memory of the reprisals would linger long after the blood had dried. The stories passed from one generation to the next carried both grief and warning, reminding people of the cost of standing against a system built on violence, but also keeping alive the knowledge that resistance had existed, that men and women had dared to challenge the order even when the consequences were severe. In many, the reprisals became part of the rebellion's legacy, a reminder that freedom was never simply granted but had to be fought for in the face of overwhelming odds. Looking back, historians recognize that these events marked one of the most violent and tragic responses to resistance in American history. The uprising itself had been small, involving only a fraction of those enslaved in Virginia, but the scale of the retaliation was vast, swallowing up lives indiscriminately. It laid bare the truth that slavery was maintained not only through laws and economic structures but through raw, unrelenting violence. When the system felt threatened, it lashed out with a force that left no room for innocence, no room for mercy, and in doing so, it revealed the brutality at its core to the world and to history. The aftermath of the rebellion reminds us of the precarious balance enslaved people lived under every day, caught between endurance and the dream of freedom, between the hope of survival and the constant threat of punishment. For those who lived through the reprisals, life could never return to what it had been before, and for those who heard the stories, the lesson was clear. Resistance carried unimaginable risks, but submission came at the cost of dignity and humanity. Even in the darkest hours, the rebellion and its aftermath planted seeds of awareness, seeds that would continue to grow until the system itself could no longer stand. Thus, the violence that followed Nat Turner's uprising was not only an ending, but also a beginning, a harsh reminder of the price of oppression and a testament to the enduring human spirit that refuses to be silenced, even when the cost is measured in blood and sorrow. For weeks after the rebellion collapsed, Nat Turner lived as a fugitive, hiding in the dense woods and swamps of Virginia. The land itself seemed to shield him at first, its tangled brush and murky waters providing cover from the relentless patrols scouring the countryside. Dogs, bounty hunters, and vigilantes searched endlessly, certain that his capture would bring closure to a shaken community still reeling from fear and anger. Yet Turner, resourceful and determined, managed to evade them. He moved silently at night, slept in makeshift shelters during the day, and survived on scraps of food taken from the fields or offered in secret by sympathetic individuals. For 6 long weeks, the tension in Southampton County did not ease. Whispers of his presence spread like wildfire, with every shadow in the woods and every rustle in the cornfields fueling the belief that Turner was still out there. Watching, waiting. His ability to remain hidden gave him an almost mythic quality in the eyes of both his supporters and his enemies. But in late October, his luck finally ran out. He was discovered near a muddy hole, exhausted and weak, no longer able to sustain the desperate existence he had endured since the uprising. His capture spread quickly, and his fate was sealed. Turner was brought into custody and subjected to questioning, though he reportedly carried himself with a strange calm, as though he had already accepted the inevitability of what would come. To his captors, he showed little fear. Instead, he seemed resolute, even when the weight of the rebellion's destruction and the harsh reprisals it provoked loomed over him. By the time of his trial, the court had already determined the outcome, but the proceedings gave Turner the chance to speak. His confession, recorded by attorney Thomas Gray, offered a glimpse into his beliefs. He described visions, signs in the heavens, and a divine calling that he felt compelled to follow. To Turner, the rebellion had been more than an earthly act of defiance. It was, in his, a fulfillment of a spiritual mission. The trial lasted only a short time, and the sentence was swift. On November 11th, 1831, Turner was executed by hanging. Crowds gathered to witness, some driven by vengeance, others by morbid curiosity. His final moments, like his rebellion, left a mark on the American consciousness. Yet what followed was designed to erase any possibility of his legacy being revered. His body was treated harshly after his death, not only as punishment for his role in the uprising, but also as a warning to others who might harbor similar thoughts of resistance. Officials believed that displaying such brutality would deter enslaved people from ever attempting another revolt, and it was intended as a message that lingered long after Turner's final breath. The cruelty inflicted upon Turner after his execution reflects the intense fear his rebellion had created among the white population. His 6 weeks in hiding had already elevated him into a symbol of resistance, and in the minds of the authorities, breaking that symbol required more than simply ending his life. The violent aftermath of his death mirrored the wider wave of retribution that swept across Virginia and beyond, where countless enslaved and free black people, many with no connection to the rebellion, suffered reprisals. In this way, Turner's fate was bound tightly to the broader narrative of oppression and the unrelenting grip of slavery in the American South. And yet, despite the attempt to erase him through violence, Turner's story endured. His name remained on the lips of those who feared him and those who drew inspiration from him. The stark image of a man who had risked everything, lived in hiding against impossible odds, and faced death with composure could not be easily erased. For many, his rebellion was a desperate cry for justice in a world where no peaceful path existed for the enslaved. His visions, his courage, and even his tragic end became woven into the memory of resistance that stretched across generations. In this way, the 6 weeks he spent hidden in the wilderness, and the grim fate that followed, only deepened the haunting legacy of Nat Turner. In the aftermath of Nat Turner's rebellion, the South and North found themselves more deeply divided than ever before. Southern leaders, shaken by the uprising, responded with fear and severity. They passed laws designed to strip away even the smallest freedoms enslaved people had clung to. Education for the enslaved was outlawed, as literacy was seen as a dangerous path to empowerment and resistance. Large gatherings were forbidden, ensuring that enslaved communities could not organize or share ideas that might threaten the system. These laws not only deepened the suffering of millions, but also cemented a legacy of fear and control that would weigh heavily on the South for generations. Meanwhile, in the North, Turner's rebellion sent shockwaves that stirred the hearts of abolitionists. For some, it was undeniable proof that slavery was a system so brutal, so dehumanizing, that resistance was inevitable. Writers, activists, and preachers took the rebellion as a rallying cry. They pointed to Turner's actions not merely as violence, but as the desperate outpouring of a people denied their humanity. Abolitionist movements grew stronger, and the national conversation about slavery became impossible to silence. Nat Turner himself remains a complex and polarizing figure. To enslaved men and women who longed for freedom, he was a symbol of courage and defiance, someone who dared to rise up when others only dreamed of change. To slaveholders and their descendants, he was remembered as a threat, a violent challenger to their way of life. And in the broader sweep of American history, Turner lives in the gray space between hero and villain, his story forcing us to confront the painful realities of oppression, resistance, and the high cost of freedom. His life and death remind us that history is rarely simple. It is filled with individuals who made choices in impossible circumstances, choices that reflected both the cruelty of the systems they lived under and the unbreakable human desire for dignity. Turner's rebellion did not bring freedom to the enslaved, but it exposed the fragility of the institution and planted seeds of resistance that would grow for decades. Ultimately, it added pressure to a nation already straining under the weight of slavery, a pressure that would eventually erupt into civil war and, at last, emancipation. As we look back today, Nat Turner's story continues to challenge us. It asks us to think deeply about justice, morality, and the lengths to which people will go when every other path has been closed. It forces us to wrestle with uncomfortable truths about violence and oppression, about the clash between ideals and lived realities. Most importantly, it reminds us that the struggle for freedom has never been easy, but it has always been necessary. Thank you for joining me in exploring this chapter of history, a story that is as haunting as it is thought-provoking. If you found this journey meaningful, I would truly appreciate it if you could like this video, share it with others who care about understanding the past, and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss future explorations of history's most compelling stories.